Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next edition of the Governor's Office of Small Business Assistance Small Business Webinar Series featuring basics of business licensing. We're going to give it just another minute or two before we get started to allow as many people to attend the entire event. As we're waiting, we're going to post a couple of interactive questions into the Q&A field. We'd like for each of you to identify which of these statements best represents you. So there are two statements here. I am thinking about starting a business or have recently, within 2 years, started a business. Or I started a business more than 2 years ago. Please select which of these statements or like which of these statements best represents you. You can find the Q&A feed in the upper right of your screen. It will be in the Featured Feed tab. So again, like which one of these statements best represents you in your entrepreneurial journey. To get us started, we would like to welcome our Executive Director of Economic Development and Tourism, Mrs. Adriana Cruz. Mrs. Adriana is going to provide some welcoming remarks. Over to you, Adriana.
Thank you, Jarvis, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining today. I'm Adriana Cruz. I'm the Executive Director of the Economic Development and Tourism Office here in the Office of Governor Abbott. And on behalf of the Governor and the team at the Economic Development and Tourism Office, I want to thank you for joining us for today's Governor's Small Business Webinar. Our goal is to provide you with information and connect you with local resources that can help you to find success. Our office is committed to work with Texas business owners like yourself to make sure that Texas continues to be ranked as the top state in the country to start a business and to be an entrepreneur. In fact, Texas is ranked as the best state in the country to start a business and the top state for jobs created by Black business owners and by Black, Hispanic, and veteran women-owned business owners. Texas's small business owners and entrepreneurs are the backbone of our state's economy, representing 99% of our businesses and employing nearly half of all working Texans. And we appreciate everything that you do to keep our economy going strong. We have a great panel for you today to talk about the basics of business licensing. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar and that you learned some helpful information as you pursue your entrepreneurial journey. Please don't hesitate to reach out to our small business team, Jarvis Brewer and Brian Roller. Their contact information will be provided at the end of the webinar. And please let us know if there's anything we can do to assist you as you continue to do business in the Lone Star State. Jarvis, back over to you.
Thank you, Mrs. Cruz, for that welcoming, and you're absolutely right. Feel free. We encourage you to reach out to us at the end of this if there's any way that we can be of assistance to you. So now we're going to enter two more interactive statements. We would like for you to like which of these two statements as well that best represents you. So these statements are, my business provides a tangible product, or my business provides a service or intangible product. Again, like which one of these statements best reflects you in your entrepreneurial journey. As Mrs. Cruz mentioned, we have a great panel here for you today. We're fortunate, next slide please. We're fortunate to have a representative of the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, Mr. Steve Bruno. Steve is a Senior Government Relations Officer with Tdlr. Additionally, we have David Eskew, who is a staff attorney in Public Filings Division with the Office of the Texas Secretary of State. Thank you for being here today, Mr. Eskew. And last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Soluto Uba, who is a business law attorney with the Uber Law Group. Thank you for being here as well. So each one of these gentlemen will provide some FAQs related to things that they deal with on the daily, as well as they'll be here to answer your questions live at the end of the presentation during the live Q&A. So let's get to those panel questions. We'll begin with you, Mr. Bruno. You have two questions that you provided here. First, does Tdlr license general contractors? That is a question that we receive pretty much daily regarding the different contracting. So could you elaborate a little bit further on, does Tdlr license general contractors?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to be here to speak with everyone. Tdlr does not license general contractors. There is no statewide licensing requirement for general contractors. However, at Tdlr and at other agencies, there are certain trades and occupations that are licensed. Specifically, here at the Department of Licensing and Regulation, we issue licenses to electrical contractors and the electricians who work with them and for them, and air conditioning contractors and the folks who work for them as well. There are a few exceptions in each of our statutes, but what I like to say is that in general, if you are going to be performing or offering to perform electrical or air conditioning work, then you will need a license from my agency, Tdlr. If you're going to be performing plumbing work, you would need a license from a different agency, and that's going to be the Texas State Board of Plumbing Examiners. Other questions we get related to construction involve roofing, and there is currently not a statewide license requirement for roofing.
And that's a perfect example. I'm glad that you broke down the different industries within contracting. So we get that question about just general contracting, and not all contractors provide the same services. So depending on what products or services you're providing will actually determine your requirements as far as licensing or permitting. So let's go to
That is correct.
Thank you, sir. Let's go to question number 2. I see that we've jumped ahead a little bit on answering number 2, but let's go back one to the question. So what occupations does Tdlr license and regulate, Mr. Bruno?
Excellent question. And at Tdlr, we oversee 37 different programs, and they're listed here for you. One thing to keep in mind that we like to say is that we license people, we license places, and we license things. A couple of examples we've already mentioned of the people are going to be air conditioning contractors, electrical contractors. You can see here on the list, we've got used auto parts recyclers, auctioneers, athletic trainers. Places we regulate are going to be certain businesses, for example, under barbering and cosmetology, any nail salon, for example, or hair salon, also a massage therapy establishment where you might go to get a massage. Those are places that we regulate, and things will fall under the categories of boilers. Every building in the state that has a boiler in it, those boilers need to be inspected, and including elevators and escalators are other big examples of things that are regulated. As I said earlier, there are always some exceptions. One big exception that's important to know about regarding elevators is that Tdlr is responsible for all elevators and escalators in the state, except for those in the city of Houston. The law does allow certain municipalities to regulate their own programs, and Houston has chosen to regulate its own elevator and escalator program. But this list here shows you all of the 37 programs, and on our website, there's much more information about each one of those and what the requirements are in order to get and obtain a license. And then, of course, we always like for folks to understand, and you can go on our website and search for any disciplinary action. What actions could get a license taken away from you is also important to know. The last thing I'll share is that on our website, we do publish for the public a list of licensees, so that if you're considering hiring somebody, you should definitely check that list.
I'm glad you added that last bit about a list of licensees. So two things came to mind during your description. So one, another question that we receive pretty commonly is people wanting to inquire about whether a person or business has a business license. So the fact that you mentioned that Tdlr, hey, if it's within their purview, such as one of these 37 products, licenses, permits that they oversee, then they would have the list of those individuals or people, places, or things.
Yes.
So thank you so much for that.
Thank
the
you.
other thing that you mentioned that we also receive quite often is if you don't see your product, your service on this list, that does not mean that there are no requirements for you. It would be very convenient if there was one state agency that provided all licenses and permits. Unfortunately, what's convenient isn't always what's the realistic item. So depending on, as he mentioned, plumbing, or what the product or service is, there may be another state agency or municipality that administers or regulates your product or service. So keep that in mind. I'll talk about our licensing and permits guide later on in this event. That is a great tool that has everything all in one place. Thank you, Mr. Bruno. We'll move on further to our next panelist, Mr. David Eskew. How are you doing this morning / afternoon, sir?
I'm doing very well. Thank you. I want to echo my appreciation for the opportunity to participate today, to be part of this, and very much looking forward to it.
Well, thank you for being here as well. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your team, and what the Secretary of State does.
My name is David Eskew. I'm one of the staff attorneys in the Business and Public Filings Division with the Texas Secretary of State. One of the primary responsibilities of our office is we're a ministerial filing officer for business entity filings and certain other documents that are required to be filed with our office. A lot of these, and you'll notice on one of the first questions is relates to business entity filings that are submitted to our office in order to create or form certain entities.
Absolutely. So let's go forward right into those questions. Which type or which entity types are created or formed by filing document with the Texas Secretary of State?
Certain by statute, certain entities can only be created or formed by filing a document with our office. That document is called a certificate of formation, and some of the common entities, business types, entity structures that are created or formed by office include for-profit corporations, nonprofit corporations, limited liability companies, and limited partnerships. You'll note in each one of those entity types has a reference to a form. We do have forms on our website, which we highly encourage because they're drafted to meet minimum statutory requirements in order to help a document be filed. Certainly recommend using our forms if they're available. On the other hand, there are certain business types or business structures that do not require a filing in order to be created or formed. These include sole proprietorships and general partnerships. There may still be filing requirements for those types of businesses, but those would be on the county level and not any type of filing with our office.
Sure thing, and we get that question quite often as far as should they file with the Secretary of State's office or with their local county clerk's office. So it's determined by what entity type you choose.
Correct.
So,
general rule of thumb: if you have to file with our office to create your entity, then any type of subsequent filings would be with our office as well as a general rule. But if not, then any type of filing would generally be at the county level. And I do want to note that those types of entities that are filed with our office, they're labeled domestic entities, which would generally describe entities that are created by a filing with our office. And we have that term in the statute to contrast with foreign entities, which some of y'all may be associated with, that were formed in a jurisdiction other than Texas. Sometimes we get questions about whether a foreign entity has to file with our office. The statute does require it if that entity is transacting business in Texas, and it's a separate filing. It's called an application for registration, but we do almost on a daily, sometimes multiple times a day, have questions about whether a particular filing is required with our office. It is a certificate of formation is required to form a domestic or a Texas entity, and then a application for registration is required if a foreign entity is transacting business in Texas. And foreign entity would describe any entity that was formed under the laws of a jurisdiction other than Texas. So that could include Oklahoma, Delaware, another U.S. state, or even a foreign country.
Thank you so much for even bringing that up. I think as our small business team was considering putting together a webinar to talk about this topic, I think one of the main drivers of us choosing to do business licensing in Texas is that phrase, business licensing. And it varies depending on where you're at. For example, some other states may have a general business license requirement. And if you have that knowledge or coming from another state, as we've seen a lot of people who have moved to Texas and want to start a business or move their business from another state, they may be aware of that general business license. Well, that requirement doesn't exist here in the state of Texas. And so we really wanted to separate registering a business and filing a business from some of the things that Steve Bruno just mentioned, the specific licenses and permits that are based solely on the products and services that you provide. So that was kind of our reasoning of wanting to really get to the basics of what a quote unquote business license is. And we wanted to separate registration from specific licensing and permits. So thank you for bringing that. Foreign and out-of-state entity registration, the filing is something, as he mentioned, if you are moving a business from another state or country, that is the streamlined process through the Texas Secretary of State's office. All right. Question number 4, your second FAQ, Mr. Eskew, is what is a new veteran-owned business?
A new veteran-owned business was an option provided by the legislature beginning January 1st of this year, and it provides that certain entities that qualify as a new veteran-owned business are not subject to certain filing fees under the Texas Business Organizations Code, which is the statute that primarily governs business entities in Texas, and are not subject to the state franchise taxes for the earlier of the 5th anniversary of the entity's existence, or if it ceased to qualify as a new veteran-owned business. There are certain criteria that the entity has to meet. Those are discussed in more detail in the link that's at the bottom of the slide. I will note that it has to be formed after January 1st of this year and on or after January 1st of this year, and before January 1st of 2026. And it must be 100% owned by an individual or individuals, with each owner being an honorably discharged veteran from a branch of the U.S. Armed Services. So we've got a couple questions about whether it would apply to someone that was in the military of a different country and has since moved to Texas. Unfortunately, it doesn't. The statute is pretty clear that it's applicable only to honorably discharged veterans from a branch of the U.S. Armed Services. In order to, as I mentioned previously, domestic entities are formed by filing a certificate of formation with our office. If you were to form a new veteran-owned business, such as a limited liability company, an LLC, or a for-profit corporation, you would need to include additional documentation from the Texas Veterans Commission, as well as the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts, and that's the state agency that administers taxes, including the state franchise tax. Those requirements are also discussed in detail in the webpage that's linked below. Both of those offices are familiar with the new veteran-owned business as provided by the legislature, but the webpage linked below has links to the specific documents that you would need to request and provide at the time that you submit the certificate of formation with our office.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for even going into another question that we get asked quite often, which is certifications. So that's why we've talked about licensing and permits. We've talked about registration, and now a little bit about certifications. And as Mrs. Cruz mentioned in her welcoming, she mentioned how Texas is a top state for minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, and now even veteran-owned businesses. So one certification that we have at the state level is called the HUB certification, which stands for Historically Underutilized Business Certification. So if you do provide a product or service and would like to provide that product or service to a state agency or state public university, I definitely recommend looking into the HUB certification to provide a competitive advantage for you and your business to provide that product or service to the state. Okay, let's move forward. Thus far, we've had the Q&A closed, but it is now open. So you can go ahead. We encourage you to go ahead and submit your questions to our panel. We do have another panelist to get to as far as the FAQs, but please go ahead and submit your questions so that our panelists can address them. The way that you'll submit them is through that Q&A tab as well. Watch out for other people's questions and like questions that you would like to see that other people have submitted you would like to see answered. That's how we will actually prioritize the questions to our panel. So the most liked questions will be asked first. So again, go ahead and start submitting your questions now. Let's move to you, Mr. Uba. How are you doing, sir? Tell us a little bit about yourself and the Uba Law Group.
Hey, thank you so much, Mr. Brewer. Just first of all, I just want to thank the entire office for the invitation. My name is Soluto Uba. I'm the founder of the Uba Law Group. We help business owners protect their business, brand, and bank. And so what that means specifically is as you're out there crushing it in whatever industry you're in, we want to help protect the legal side of your business with an established business entity. You know, entrepreneurship is a great venture, but there can be some risks. There can be some legal things that are on the other side of that venture. So we got to make sure that you're protected legally. And so we do that. And we also help our clients protect their brand with trademarks and make sure that intellectual property is protected, as well as do a little bit of tax strategy. And just we try to help the overall package of the entrepreneur.
Yes, absolutely. And that's great that you are out there serving our Texas entrepreneurs as well. And I'm sure you encounter a lot of the same questions that my office, as well as the Tdlr and SOS received. So I think between the three of our panelists today, we'll be able to address many of the concerns that our audience will have. So let's get into your FAQ. Number 5, your first. Does my business license my DBA provide me with legal protection?
Yeah, so this is a question that we hear all the time. So it'll be a business owner in whatever field. We have folks in the trades, whether you're a licensed electrician, plumber, whatever the case is. The question that we see is, does this professional licensure or a DBA or a trade name for your company, does it provide me with legal protection? And so the answer is no. So whether you're a professional in whatever area, or whether you started a business, whether it's a sole proprietorship and you just started off on your own and you're doing the business under your personal name, your personal social security number, or whatever, if you do not have a legal entity set up, you do not have legal protection. So to break that down really quickly, there's two types of liability that you'll mainly experience when you're running a business. There's personal liability, which means you are personally on the hook, and then there's corporate liability, which means that you have a business set up, some sort of legal entity set up that will serve to protect you, and that legal entity will be the one that's on the hook. So an example that I like to use all the time is a lemonade stand. So I start Soluto's lemonade stand, and I'm a sole proprietor. and say I have a lemonade license, if that was even a thing that existed. Without a business entity, if someone drinks my lemonade and they get sick and they want to sue me or take legal action against me, I have personal liability. If I'm just a sole proprietorship, even if I have a DBA, I still have personal liability. I'm personally on the hook. So somebody can come after my personal assets to satisfy some legal obligation against me. However, if I form a business entity, a legal entity, such as a corporation or an LLC, which is one of the most popular entities, if I form Soluto's Lemonade LLC and I'm selling lemonade and unfortunately someone gets sick from my lemonade and they want to sue or take legal action, they can only come after my LLC. They can't come after my personal assets because I'm running my business out of an LLC. So it's not the business license or even the DBA or anything like that that provides you with legal protection. It's actually setting up and establishing your business with a legal entity like an LLC.
That is a great explanation. And we get asked quite often, should I form a DBA or LLC? And that is just, ultimately, that's going to be something that you, the individual, the entrepreneur, is going to have to answer themselves. However, something great that the SOS has is they have many of the most common business structures or entity types on their website and a brief description of each one. But I do a brief summary of the two most common that you have listed here, DBA and LLC. First, I'll go ahead and, I was in the military and we use acronyms for everything. I'll go ahead and explain what those acronyms actually stand for. DBA, doing business as, and LLC, limited liability company. So in that name, LLC, the owner has LL, limited liability. Indeed. And then in the DBA, that person, that sole proprietor, is doing business as something else, but it's still that individual who's doing that business. So there is no real separation of the individual from the business in the DBA, whereas the person has limited liability in the LLC.
And
so
I'll even add on to that, just real quick, Mr. Brewer. So you can have a DBA for your LLC. So I can start Soluto's Lemonade LLC, and I realize that's not the most marketable name. So I could file a DBA for Soluto's Lemonade LLC and call it, Lemon Squeeze or whatever a nice marketable name is. But in that situation, it would be my LLC operating under the DBA. So the analogy I like to tell people that is that a DBA is a glove. It'll go on top of something, and whatever is underneath the glove is the type of protection that you have. So if your DBA is the glove on top of a sole proprietorship, then the DBA doesn't have any legal protection because the sole proprietorship doesn't have any legal protection. If your DBA is the glove on top of an LLC, then that DBA has legal protection because the LLC underneath it had legal protection. So that's a very good point that you bring up, because we also encounter that question a lot amongst our clients.
That is a perfect explanation. Thank you so much, sir, for that. Let's go into your second FAQ. If I have multiple business licenses, can I then run multiple businesses out of the same LLC?
Yeah. So this is a question that we come across also a lot, because we have folks that are in industries and in trades like construction, the trades, electricians, plumbers, all that stuff, who have folks that work for them that have different multiple licenses. So the question becomes, can I run all those businesses out of the same legal entity? So I'm gonna have to give you all the legal lawyer answer and say, yeah, but. So technically you can run as many businesses as you want out of an LLC. The main restriction is if there are certain entities that are professional entities, such as attorney, dentist, architect, accountant, different entities, medical professionals like that. You have the P professional designation that some of those industries have. So you cannot run multiple businesses that are professional entities out of the same LLC, but everything that doesn't have that professional designation, and you can find more information about this on the Secretary of State's website, of course, but entities that do not have a professional designation, you technically can run out of the LLC, run out of the same LLC. Now, here's where I put on the lawyer and the advisor and the business advisor hat, and I tell someone, does it make sense to do that? Just because you can do something doesn't mean that it makes practical sense and it's strategic for you as a business owner to do something. So in this type of instance, I often advise clients not to. So you have multiple businesses, particularly businesses that require multiple license. You want to protect those individual businesses with different LLCs. And the big reason for that is because if you're running 3 different businesses out of the same LLC, let's say they're all very successful businesses. You have an HVAC company, you have a plumbing company, and you have an electrical company. And all 3 of those companies, you're crushing it. You're bringing in $200,000 from all of those companies. If they're all in the same LLC, if there's legal action by one of those companies, they can come after the money and the funds from all of them because they're all in the same LLC. So we want to protect and we want to limit your risk. So we're going to have you set up different legal entities for the different businesses. So we don't want all the eggs to be in one basket. So in order to protect you, we would have you set up different legal entities to minimize your risk. So that's the yeah, but. Technically, you could put many entities, many businesses inside of one LLC or one legal entity, but the question is, should you? And oftentimes, it's not the wisest or the most strategic thing to put multiple businesses in the same entity because you then expand your risk.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that explanation. I know that's very important to our audience to hear and to mitigate risk. So thank you, sir, for that. Now that I've had a little bit of time to go through our interactive questions, I see that roughly 75% of our audience is thinking about starting a business or have recently started in less than 2 years. So that means a quarter or 2 years or more. So we have a lot of early stage business owners in our audience. With that, about 75% also are in the service industry, so they don't have a tangible product or good. So many of these people may fall into the category of I provide maybe a professional service or some kind of service that may require me to get something from Tdlr. Maybe I'm one of those people that Mr. Bruno spoke about. Now we are going to go into our live questions and answers. So I just want to provide that information for our panelists to kind of give us an idea of who we're speaking to, early stage and a lot of service providers. But as we go into our live Q&A, these next questions, I'm going to just do my best to throw them to a panelist. But by all means, if there is another panelist who has additional to provide on any question, definitely feel free to keep this kind of fluid and communicative. So by no means do I mean to only get information from one panelist. This first question, I think it's best asked to Mr. Eskew. The question is, please describe changes to the Texas Series LLC that became effective last month. Would you happen to have information about that new change?
Certainly. Beginning June 1st of this year, the subchapter in the Texas Business Organizations Code was amended to provide for 2 types of series. Previously, there was only one type, and as a brief background, a series LLC is a traditional LLC that has certain language in its certificate of formation and other governing documents that allows for individual series within that LLC. Some of the benefits include providing some protection for each of the individual series, and they can be customized in terms of management and the purpose and assets and liabilities. Prior to June 1st of this year, a series was created internally by the entity. There wasn't any filing with our office to create the series, the individual series, once the LLC, the quote unquote parent entity, was created. Going from June 1st going forward, there are now 2 types of series that can be created in Texas. One is called a protected series, and the other is referred to as a registered series. The protected series is very similar to what we had previously in that there's no filing to create it. A registered series can only be created or established by filing a certificate of registered series with our office. And there are that we haven't yet, and we don't anticipate drafting a form for a certificate of registered series, primarily because the required information is relatively minimal, and there are some naming conventions that have to be included with respect to the registered series. But other than the filing requirement, a protected series and a registered series share the same attributes. It's just one is created by filing with our office. That filing does have a $300 filing fee that's set by statute, but otherwise the attributes are the same between the two types of series.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that information. I didn't expect us to talk about it. I know it's a recent change, but obviously that was our most liked question. So many people wanted to hear about it with it being a new addition or new, change to the series. So thank you so much for that explanation.
Certainly.
Our next question, I am going to answer it directly. I just posted a link. So it was sent anonymously, but the question was, to qualify for the HUB certification, do all owners must reside in Texas? I brought up the HUB certification. We weren't expecting to talk about it, but since I did, I actually just posted the link to the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts. They are the administrators of that program, of that certification, and that link will take you to their page where they have the eligibility. For most of the eligibility statements or requirements, it must be 51% owned by someone meeting that eligibility. So definitely take a look at that. I highly advise connecting with the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts if you are interested in doing business with the state of Texas. All right, so next question. What is the status of already existing veteran business? How can they qualify? So this is for you, Mr. Eskew. I would like to add something after you, but if I'm already existing, I'm not between, I believe it was January 1st now and then until 2026. What can I do?
So there was the legislature previously provided for some of the same benefits that I mentioned earlier for veteran-owned businesses that were formed on or after January 1st of 2016 through December 31st of 2019. If you otherwise would have qualified as a new veteran-owned business and did not take advantage of those benefits, the link to the veteran webpage on our site does provide additional information in terms of attaining those documents. You can, once you have obtained those, you can submit them by email and include a cover letter with some information about your entity, the filing number, your contact information, and a request for the refund of those filing fees. If the entity would be eligible, we can provide a refund of those filing fees because they were provided by the statute. Unfortunately, there was about a 2-year gap in between the statute that is currently available and the one that was previously provided. So unfortunately, if you formed an entity between January 1st of 2020 and December 31st of 2021, the legislature didn't provide for any type of benefit for new veteran-owned businesses. But if you chose to form a new entity, piggybacking off of Mr. Uba's answer to his FAQ, and you would otherwise qualify as a new veteran-owned business, then you would have access to those benefits. And I do want to any questions about if you were a previously formed entity and would otherwise qualify, certainly any benefit with our exemption with respect to the franchise tax, want to contact the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts.
Absolutely. And the one thing I wanted to add to that, I know you mentioned the Texas Veterans Commission earlier. They started, I don't recall the actual date off the top of my head. I know it's been within the last couple of years, the Texas Veteran-Owned Business logo. And I know that 75% or so of our audience provide a product, and then that other quarter is a physical, or excuse me, 75 provide a service, and then that other quarter is a product. However, if you do have a packaged good, or even if you have a service and you would like to have that logo on your, whether it be your business card, your vehicle, whatever, on your website, that logo can tie you in and certify you as a veteran-owned business here in the state of Texas. So that is something, again, it's a new program that the TVC, Texas Veterans Commission, started within the last couple of years. And it may be something to just put alongside your own company's name and logo that ties you into, yes, this is a veteran-owned business. So thank you, Mr. Eskew, for that explanation. Moving along, I see that Lauren has posted, Lauren Vey, who's one of our moderators behind the scenes, she has posted our online licensing and permits guide. I'll talk about that here in a little bit later as well, as we get back into the licensing and permits portion of this event. But let's go to our next question that's been posted. I have a business name that I would like to register, selling baked goods at local farmers markets. Do I have to start the LLC or other when registering the name? So there's two parts of this, the name component and then registration component. So I know Mr. Uba mentioned earlier about a DBA, but I'm going to start with the registration of the business for you, Mr. Eskew. Mr. Uba, you may have additional items in here, and then Tdlr, Mr. Bruno, you may have specific items since they mentioned about what they're actually selling. So let's start with you, Mr. Eskew.
Okay, and would you mind repeating the first part of that question?
Sure. I have a business name that I would like to register. So they want to register the name, and they say that they're selling baked goods at local farmers markets. Do I have to start the LLC or other entity type when registering the name? So do they have to register the business before they register the name?
So and another lawyer answer, classic lawyer answer is it depends. As part of the filings with our office, especially a certificate of formation to create or form a domestic LLC, those filings are subject to name availability rules by statute. The names of filing entities, which would include an LLC, have to be distinguishable in our records. And so each formation document that we receive, we check the name to see if it is distinguishable or the same as other entities on file in our records. So separate from filing the formation document to actually create or form the entity, there is the option to submit a name reservation. So if a person had a particular name in mind, but maybe they weren't quite ready to form the entity or create the entity, they could submit a name reservation. The benefit of that is the filing fee is a little bit less compared to the filing fee to form an entity. But the benefit would be that it would reserve or prevent another entity, whether foreign or domestic, from forming or registering with our office under a name that was the same as what was provided in the name reservation.
And that's a great point about name. I'd like to touch on that a little bit later as well about naming rights. But to get back to this question, one of the things why I wanted Mr. Uba's perspective is because he mentioned about DBAs and how an LLC can have a different name. So I would like to get your perspective on that again, Mr. Uba.
Yeah, and Mr. Eskew is exactly right. The two main considerations that we tell clients to think through is, number one, the name availability. You have the option to reserve that name if you're not ready to take the step to form the LLC or the entity. But then, of course, kind of like you said, if somebody else has a name or has a name that's really, really similar to what you have, there's the chance that that name will not be available. The Secretary of State's office will not allow you to register that name. But for this reason, DBAs are a viable option. You can have a DBA that is duplicitous of something that already exists. So you can have a DBA. I tell clients, if their heart is set on a certain business name and they're just married to that name, you can register the LLC under a different name and then create a DBA to do business as that desired name. Now, this is where we put the strategy hat back on. is it always the best idea for you to have a business name that's similar or the same as someone else? That might not be the most marketable thing for your business, but DBA rules and actual registration rules are different. So that is a possibility sometimes, even if that LLC, that name or whatever the entity name might not be available. But the question you have to think through is it always the most business savvy move to have a name that's taken, or to have a name that there's already a similar name that exists, because you don't want there to be confusion out in the marketplace when you're doing business.
Thank you so much for that addition, sir. And now I want to address the specific industry that this question comes from, TD, that TD mentioned here about selling baked goods. And I think the next question actually goes into it. The person has asked about cottage bakers. So there's something called the Cottage Food Law. Again, thus far, Mr. Eskew and Mr. Uba have mentioned about registering the LLC and then about the naming rights. That is completely separate of what you're actually doing within the business. So in this case, selling baked goods. The reason why I even mentioned Mr. Bruno with Tdlr, the licensing. So there may be specific licensing or permitting related to the selling of these baked goods. And if you're selling at home, making homemade items, or if you're establishing a brick and mortar, maybe even a restaurant or bakery. So there may be food handlers licensing and permits, which is a people thing. The building itself, they have to fall underneath specific health or permitting requirements. At the local level, it's called a permit to operate a food enterprise. So again, that's going to be specific to what you're actually doing, where the naming rights, the formation of the business is independent of the products or services you're providing. So what we have, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, on our website, we have the 2022 Licensing and Permits Guide. And while our office, thank you so much for putting that up there, Brian, while our office, there's not a single license or permit that anyone would apply or get issued from our office. However, as I mentioned earlier in the event, it would be convenient if there was one place to get all licenses and permits. Well, that doesn't exist. So what we do is every couple of years after a legislative session, we contact all of the various state agencies that issue licenses and permits, and we put that in a comprehensive guide that's broken down by industry, broken down by product service, and it has all of the potentially applicable licenses or permits that anyone operating a business within that specific industry may need to obtain. So, and the contact information for the agencies that administer it. So it's a very helpful guide. I believe Lauren has posted it in the chat earlier. However, we do have it at the end. Of course, the link is down there at the bottom as well. But we'll reference this again here in the next 10 minutes or so as we close out the event. Okay.
And if I could just quickly mention, just so it's not hanging out there, as far as Tdlr is concerned, there is no license regarding baked goods or foods from our agency.
Correct. It's not one of those 37, which
it is not.
Which correct. Again doesn't mean that there aren't requirements for it. It's just that it's not administered by Tdlr. Okay, now I'm going to get into that question, which I believe came from James. The question is a legal structure required for all businesses, even cottage bakers? So is there a legal structure required for all businesses? I think what James is asking here is, am I required to register through the Secretary of State versus a county level, such as a DBA sole proprietorship? And then is that also true for cottage bakers? I'm going to start with Mr. Uba here, and then I know Mr. Eskew, you may have some additional items to add to this. So over to you, Mr. Uba.
Yeah, so traditionally the answer is no. So a legal structure is not required to start a cottage food business. There's a huge variety of professions that don't require any structure at all. Now, there are some professions where if you do form a legal structure, so for example, I run a law firm. Our law firm is a PLLC. Because I'm in the professional category, I can't just open an LLC. The state of Texas requires me to run a PLLC, and there are other entities like that. But for the vast majority of businesses, you can start as a sole proprietorship, or you can have a DBA that you use to advertise your sole proprietorship. And so the question is not really is a legal entity required. The question is, are you going to protect yourself? Because if you can go out there without an entity, but if something wrong happens or something bad happens and if there's legal action taken without a legal entity, you're going to be exposed. LLC stands for limited liability company. So if you don't have an LLC or a corporation or some other entity, you have full personal liability on yourself. So if someone sues you, they can come after your personal assets. They can come after your, all your personal assets, typically not your house and home in the state of Texas, but things like that. So typically people will form a business entity to protect their personal assets and limit their personal liability.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Any additional comments for that, Mr. Eskew?
I will note, and I believe Mr. Uba mentioned it earlier, with respect to professional entities, there is a scattershot in terms of statutory coverage as to whether a particular type of business or service can be formed as a professional entity or is required to form as a professional entity. And professional entities include professional corporations, professional limited liability companies, and professional associations. And there's even more nuance depending on the type of professional service provided. Some professional entities are not available. For example, the practice of medicine can't be a corporation, can't be a professional corporation. But in some instances, for example, attorneys can, the practice of law might have more options than other professional services. We do have a guide on our website. If you just did a general internet search for Texas SOS Professional Entity Guide, it should come up, and it provides a pretty straightforward and organized chart that lists the professional services and then the available entities. So just as a quick reference to look at your options when you're thinking about forming an entity, and then to consider if a professional entity is required in your situation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, sir.
Sure.
We're in the last 10 minutes of our event, so I'm going to try to do a rapid fire. We still have several questions to get to, and it's unlikely we'll get to them all. But again, I know I'm taking up time here, but we will have contact information if there is anyone in our audience wanting to connect with any of our panelists or our office, the Office of the Governor. We definitely encourage it, so that information will be provided to follow up with us after the event. Okay, this next question is probably straightforward. It comes from Keyshawn. The question is, roughly how much does it cost to create an LLC or to register a business? I'm going to start with Mr. Eskew because I know the SOS has the fee schedule on the website, but then I want to also talk about DBA. So I'll go to you, Mr. Eskew, for SOS.
Certainly. And the filing fee to form or create a domestic or Texas LLC is $300. Those filing fees are set by statute. And in addition, the filing fee to file an assumed name certificate, and an assumed name is a statutory term of art that is often the equivalent of a DBA. So if on our website, if you see a reference to an assumed name or assumed name certificate, that means a DBA. It's just the Business and Commerce Code defines in that situation, in that context, it's an assumed name, and you would file an assumed name certificate with our office if you were a domestic or foreign LLC, and that's a $25 filing fee.
And one thing I want to add to that is we get that question quite often. So a good takeaway is just a standard creation of an LLC is $300 across the state of Texas.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you're wanting to file a DBA at your county clerk's office, locally, it's going to be determined by that individual county clerk. So there isn't just one. While the state is under statute to have that one $300 fee for anybody, no matter where you're at in the state of Texas, a DBA at the county level can be determined individually by that county clerk. So I've seen it range from as low as $15 to in some are in the $30s. So again, it's a pretty big variance in that cost, but it is a county level registration versus that state level.
Correct. And I do want to clarify, effective September 1st of 2019, the legislature amended the statute or the code governing assumed names and assumed name certificates. There used to be a dual filing requirement in some situations where an LLC might have to file an assumed name certificate both with our office and at the county level. But from September 1st of 2019 going forward, that dual level requirement was removed. So if an LLC would only file an assumed name certificate with our office, they would not file at the county level. And that goes for corporations and limited partnerships. Just
So that goes into what Mr. Uba mentioned earlier, as far as you can have a DBA, an assumed name for an LLC. And so that DBA, that assumed name, would be filed through the Secretary of State and not dually through the county and state. So thank you so much, Mr. Eskew. Again, certainly. Trying to rapid fire here. Let's see if we can get another great one. Okay, so this question is, again, I'm sorry, there's a lot of questions for you, Mr. Eskew. Are there waivers for licenses and or LLC formations for business startups owned by people with disabilities? Are there any kind of waivers, such as, I know that there was the veteran waiver, anything for people with disabilities?
Unfortunately, the statute generally does not provide for waivers or exemptions from filing fees. Those filing fees are set by statute. If there are certainly extenuating circumstances, I'd recommend contacting at the end of the presentation. There should be a slide with some contact information for our public information team. I'd recommend contacting them just to, because it's possible you may be able to submit some type of cover letter or any type of documentation from a separate state agency that might indirectly provide for a waiver or an exemption, but generally no. There's the Business Organizations Code doesn't provide for that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Jarvis, really quickly, I just wanted to touch on to the previous question that you addressed regarding the filing fee for the LLC as well as the DBAs. One area where we've seen clients kind of trip over is if you're operating as a sole proprietorship, partnership, some particular REITs, real estate investment trusts, and if you're operating a DBA or assumed name certificate, you typically have to register that in every county that you're doing business in or that you have a business office set up in. Whereas if you have an LLC or a corporation or an entity, then the filing is good for the entire state, especially with the amendment that was completed in 2019, like Mr. Eskew mentioned. So that is kind of important. So when we set up LLCs for clients, one of the added benefits that they get is one DBA pretty much for the state, but you got to be very careful, especially if you live in if you have a range of business where you work in a few different counties and you're operating business in a few different counties. You want to make sure that your DBA is compliant and registered, and sometimes that will also entail registering in different county clerks' offices. So that's for the DBA piece. But just I got to make sure that I represent for the attorneys, for the business attorneys there. It costs $300 to file for an LLC in the state of Texas, $308.10 after the convenience filing fees. However, if you are working with an attorney that's helping you draft operating agreements, different entity documents that also typically come along with forming an LLC, those are additional costs. So I'm always there. I'm always providing resources for our business owners so they're able to be as well educated as possible. But when possible, we tell our business owners, invest in a professional to help you make sure that you're doing the right steps and you're getting set up properly. And that investment will sometimes almost always be more than just the actual filing fee with the state. So those are two additional things to keep in mind. Oh, Jarvis, I think you're muted there.
I told you it was going to happen. Thank you to each of you for what you do for our small business environment here in the state of Texas. Again, I appreciate each and every one of our panelists here. I appreciate each and every one of our audience members for being here today. But as we're coming to the 2 o'clock hour, we are going to unfortunately have to wrap this up. Now I want to get into some of the resources. Again, I mentioned earlier our licensing and permits guide, a wonderful guide that we have on our website. I believe Mr. Uba occasionally will use this guy. So I definitely recommend if you do have specific, I know we didn't get a lot into the Tdlr, which has the 37 different industries that they provide, but if you have questions about your specific licenses and permits based on your products and services, this guide is going to be your friend. Additionally, our office will be your friend as well. This is, I like to think of this, our small business resource portal, as our third member of our team. So we launched this small business resource portal in March of last year, and it provides information regarding pretty much anything you can think of related to small business. And this year, just a few months ago on April 26th, we added licensing and permits to this small business resource. So not only is it providing funding information, networking information, where you can find resources such as Sbdcs, SCORE, but you can now find licensing and permits information related to your business and your area in this guide. So highly recommend using our small business resource portal. And then, as the last bubble says, you can contact the small business team, which is right here, directly from the portal. So this is our small business assistance team. Along with myself, I'm Jarvis Brewer, the small business advocate. We have Brian Roller, who's the business assistance specialist. This is our contact information. You can contact us for general small business inquiries at that email address, smallbusiness@gov.texas.gov, or for general business permitting and licensing at businesspermits@gov.texas.gov. We also wanted to give a shout out to Jack Harrell. He will be the newest addition of our team. Has not started yet. He will be starting on Monday, hence the silhouette. But he will also, and that is his contact information as another member of our team. So here's some contact information and resources as well. You're attending the Basics of Business Licensing in Texas, which is one of our webinars in our webinar series. You can find our webinars at that link provided, and we will upload these slides and every slides from every webinar to that link within the next 48 hours. Also, our events calendar, which doesn't only have webinars, but our in-person events as well. You can find that at that link provided. I mentioned Sbdcs, which stands for Small Business Development Centers. They are your, as I mentioned, the resource portal and the licensing and permits guide is your friend. The Small Business Development Centers should be your best friend. They're all across the state of Texas and provide hands-on assistance with any kind of business assistance you may need. So definitely reach out to your local Sbdc. Now we have the information for each one of our panelists. So the Tdlr, that is their website and the contact hotline phone number, so you can reach this Tdlr. The same for the SOS. So we have two different links there. SOS Direct, which is where you can file and pay your filing fees directly through their online portal system, as well as their hotline number provided. Also there is the SOS's FAQ. This is highly recommended by Mr. Eskew. Definitely if you have some questions that probably weren't answered during here, they're likely going to be on that link. And then connect with a professional such as Mr. Uba, who was here, and that is his website as well. We want to thank each one of our panelists, and thank you, our audience, for being here today. Stay tuned as we'll have other wonderful, informative events. Right now, as it is now 2 o'clock, you will be receiving a webinar, or excuse me, a webinar survey about this event. We want to hear from you. What did you like? What didn't you like? What topics would you like to hear spoken about? So definitely respond to that survey. It definitely helps us guide the information that we provide to you. Again, have a great rest of your day, and let's go Texas.